iconic abuse at Abu Ghraib with the hooded prisoner and all that was going on while I was there. It's very confusing because I was in the 320th MP company, and that abuse took place in the 320th MP battalion. So it's very similar. But it was actually taking place across the prison yard. The prison camp that I showed you with the razor wire, that was for the normal detainees. There was a group of about 100 high-value detainees that were kept in a separate area called the hard site. That was an indoor prison facility, and that's where all the abuses took place. So all that actually happened in late December, early January. It didn't break in the States until months later. But I remember it because our captain stood us all in formation and chewed us out and said, I've been hearing all these rumors about photographs and things going on, and if you have any photos that you're not supposed to have, get rid of them. Don't send them back home. The MPs are going to toss your bag next week, so make sure you've got rid of everything. Then the MPs came, searched our bags. Of course, they didn't find anything since we had just been warned. So when the abuse broke back home, we had all seen photos of it previously, and no one was surprised because we're like, oh, well, that's what they were talking about. We were surprised it had gotten out and that it had broken in CNN. But the culture of the military, and a direct quote from my captain is, we're all a family here. We don't air our dirty laundry in public. So not only was my captain and General Karpinski aware of the abuse long before it came out in America, their default response was not, stop doing this. Their default response was, stop talking about it. Stop sending the photos back. And that's basically how the Army polices itself. It just tries to destroy problems and make them disappear and not really root them out.
So do you think that there should be kind of a trial or something in the future over all of this torture and going on?
Absolutely. I mean, there were some trials, but they just kind of arbitrarily cut the chain of accountability, and they held the low-ranking soldiers, they gave them short prison terms, and everyone above, basically above General Karpinski, was scot-free. General Karpinski herself was not drummed out of the military, but pressured to leave and ultimately retired. And I think they should hold them accountable, but I'm really torn about it because on one hand, I don't excuse individual bad behavior. Like, any private soldier knows you're not supposed to do that to prisoners, so they should be forced to leave the military. They don't belong in the military, clearly. But I refuse to look at these individuals in isolation, apart from the culture, apart from the whole chain of command. So I want accountability from the top to the bottom. And if you're only going to hold the little guy responsible, it's a miscarriage of justice.
Sir?
Just to follow up on that, would veterans, say if you're a unit, people like them, be more likely to favor a truth commission as opposed to investigations that would lead to prosecutions? In other words, the idea that because they might get more information out there.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of truth and reconciliation because I think at this point, individual finger pointing, except for the top guys, is kind of counterproductive. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me to prosecute individual privates and sergeants when we're really dealing with a whole systemic problem and the whole culture of the military. So I think when you get away from the blame and the legal part of it, you get a lot more truth out. I mean, I've shown all my photos and I've given depositions to the Judge Advocate General, to the Inspector General about Abu Ghraib, and nothing comes of it. So when you leave the military to police itself, to investigate itself, you can imagine what comes of it. So I think a Truth and Reconciliation Committee would be basically just what we need.
I could quickly follow up. Sure. I mean, with people that were in your unit, people like that, in spite of the pressure to keep things in the family, so to speak, would they be more willing, do you think, some of them, to speak out if they knew it wasn't going to get anybody, it wasn't going to land anybody in jail, or would they still be just as likely to?
I think they would be more likely to speak out, but there are very, very few soldiers that feel comfortable speaking out, period. A lot of the guys in my unit contacted me and they're like, yeah, do it, but don't put my name in it. So like my buddy Private Schumacher, who gave me some of the photos of like the trophy photographs, he said, here, you take them, but don't put my name in it. Like, don't tell me where you got it. And since then, he's like changed his mind and come out with it a little bit more. But I think a lot of soldiers are willing to help out, but are not willing to really take the front and speak. So I think it's really tough to get people to talk about it, and there's only a few that really are able to. But there's a lot of support, silent support. Sir?
I just wanted to be clear. General Karpinski has, I believe, tried to say that she was a scapegoat in this whole thing. And if you could address that and one other thing, since you have been removed from Iraq for a number of years, the narrative that we hear now is that we we've had a surge, things have stabilized, American soldiers are not being killed, and this is pretty much off the table. We'll be focusing on Afghanistan. So I was wondering what your impression of the situation in Iraq today is.
Let me just answer the second question really quickly. I support President Obama's drawdown strategy, not because it's my ideal solution, but because it seems like the best of several bad alternatives. So I'm in favor of reducing the commitment to Iraq. But if people think that the Iraq war has cooled off, they're sorely mistaken. I mean, we have 4,200 soldiers who've been killed in Iraq and many more wounded. And I really don't think that the situation has changed so dramatically. It's just dropped off the public radar and the public consciousness, especially during the election. In answer to your first question, I actually know General Karpinski quite well. I know her personally, both from when I was in the military, serving under her, and since I've left the military. She's become not a peace advocate, but definitely a critic of the military. And she wrote a blurb on my book, and I spoke to her while I was becoming a conscious objector, and since then. And I tend to support the view that she was a scapegoat. Not that I'm saying she's blameless, but what she was guilty of was basically inattention, or you might at worst call it incompetence. But she was not responsible. She was not pulling the strings and directing the abuse. That came from higher up. General Karpinski lived about 45 minutes away from Abu Ghraib prison. The prison she was supposed to be running. And she only came to visit occasionally. So at worst you might say, well, she failed to supervise her soldiers properly. But she certainly wasn't directing them to do all the things that they did. And I just also think it's very telling to be the sole woman general in Iraq, to be one of the few women general officers in the military, and then to be singled out as the mastermind. And clearly it goes all the way up as far as you want to take it. So I do tend to think of General Karpinski as having been scapegoated. Maybe that's just because I know her. Sir?
Yeah, you said, I think at one point during your talk, that you had these sort of ideals about America, and you felt, I think you used the word brokenhearted about how they weren't being fulfilled. And I just wonder, how are we doing? And based on all the talks that you've been giving, all the interactions you've been having with people in different communities, what's your sense of how America is doing in that regard?
I don't know. It's tough because it's such a self-selecting index. I generally only see people who are progressive, and then occasionally people who are so opposed to me that they come to talks, to confront me. So I don't see that big of a cross-section. But I'm very impressed that the American people are losing support for the Iraq war. I think that's a good sign, and in support for President Obama. In the micro scale, the last week in Hawaii has been really great. It's been exhausting, and high schools are a really tough audience. But I've been really impressed with the high school students I talked to. So I know that there's at least some momentum in the right direction, because these kids aren't just coming up with the idea themselves. They're clearly getting it from somewhere. And I've encountered a lot more skepticism about the military, understanding of civilian casualties, kids beginning to question, well, are we fighting terrorism, and what are we doing in Iraq? So I guess I have to say I'm pretty hopeful. And I think that the more sunlight we shine on it, the better it will be. We still haven't had general awareness yet of this kind of stuff going on in Iraq. And maybe, President Obama just lifted the ban on showing coffins coming home, and maybe this is a new transparency, a new motion for transparency. But generally, I've been very impressed with how people have responded. Generally been favorable. Sir?